Imagine a world in which people still believed that behind the horizon ships would fall off the earth. A time in which maps were full of blanks, myths and rumors populated the unknown seas. And then came the year 1492, a year that would change the history of the world forever. In that year, a Genoese seafarer sailed across the Atlantic on behalf of the Spanish crown, Christopher Columbus. His goal was actually a sea route to India. But instead, he reached a new world that had been unknown to Europe until then. The news of his voyage spread like wildfire. Suddenly, kings, adventurers, and merchants dreamed of immeasurable wealth beyond the ocean. Spain, which had just completed the Reconquista, did not want to be only a kingdom in Europe, but a world power. That is how what we now call the Spanish colonization of the Americas began. It was an era marked by adventure and discoveries, but also by violence, exploitation, and oppression. Especially in South America, Spain would build an empire that lasted for centuries and changed continents. Here, in the Andes, the tropics, and on the coasts of the Atlantic and the Pacific, Spanish conquistadors encountered great civilizations such as the Inca. What followed was a story of victory and downfall, of mission and cultural mixing, of gold rush and blood. But before we go into the details, we should be aware that this history is not only a story of conquerors, but also one of the millions of people who lost their lives, their freedom, and their cultures, and of those who survived despite everything and shaped the present-day identity of South America. Hardly had word spread that beyond the Atlantic there were unknown lands with gold and riches when a true fever of conquest broke out in Spain. Adventurers, nobles, ordinary soldiers, they all wanted to try their luck. They called themselves conquistadors, conquerors, and they wrote one of the bloodiest chapters in world history. Although Mexico is not in South America, our story begins with a man who became the model for all conquistadors, Hernán Cortés. With only a few hundred men, he conquered the mighty Aztec Empire at the beginning of the 16th century, using cunning, brutal violence, superior weapons, technology, and not least through alliances with dissatisfied indigenous peoples. His success showed that even the greatest empires of the Americas were not invincible. The name that is inseparably linked with the Spanish conquest of South America is Francisco Pizarro. With a small force of only about 180 men, he landed in 1532 on the coast of Peru in an empire that included millions of people. The Inca Empire. The Inca were weakened at that time by a civil war. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were fighting for the throne. It was precisely at this moment that the Spaniards intervened. Pizarro lured the Inca ruler Atahualpa into a trap. During the encounter in Cajamarca, the Spaniards let their cannons and horses speak. Within a few hours, they massacred thousands of Inca warriors and took Atahualpa prisoner. The Inca tried to ransom their ruler. They filled an entire room with gold and silver, one of the greatest treasures in history. But Pizarro broke his promise. After he had secured the treasure, he had Atahualpa executed in 1533. With this act, the heart of the Inca Empire fell. The Spaniards marched into Cusco and made themselves masters of the land. The conquest was not only a military triumph. It was marked by deception, violence, and ruthless greed. Entire cities were destroyed, cultures were subjugated, temples were looted. The Spaniards brought horses, cannons, and steel weapons with them. things that were completely unknown to the indigenous peoples. In addition, there was an even deadlier weapon: diseases. Smallpox, measles, and influenza carried off millions of people long before they had even seen the Spaniards. After the conquest, the systematic plundering began. Gold, silver, and precious stones were shipped to Spain in great quantities. The mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, became a particular symbol of this greed. The Spaniards said, "With the silver of Potosi, one could build a bridge all the way to Madrid, and it still would not be empty." In Spain, the conquistadors were celebrated as heroes. They received estates, titles, and riches. But for the indigenous peoples of South America, a time of oppression, exploitation, and cultural destruction began. The conquest was a turning point. Free empires became colonies, proud peoples became subjects. And that was only the beginning. After the conquistadors had subjugated the Inca Empire and large parts of South America, the next phase began: the administration and organization of the conquered territories. Adventures became colonies, and looted gold became an empire. Spain created a power structure that was to last for centuries. In order to control the enormous new territories, Spain established viceroyalties. The most important was the Viceroyalty of Peru, founded in 1542, with Lima as its capital. From here, the viceroy ruled in the name of the Spanish king over almost the entire continent. Later, the administration was divided, among other things, with the Viceroyalty of New Granada in 1717, with Bogotá as its center, and the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata in 1776, with Buenos Aires. This division was intended to secure Spain's power and prevent individual regions from becoming too powerful. The Spanish crown did not want independent conquerors who built their own empires. For that reason, it created a strict system of laws and offices. Governors, judges, officials, they all stood within a network of control that reached all the way to Madrid. Important decisions were made by the Council of the Indies in Spain. Every trade route, every ship, every silver transport was monitored. In order to organize the labor of the indigenous population, the Crown introduced the encomienda system. On paper, it was a protective agreement. Spanish settlers, the so-called encomenderos, were supposed to protect their indigenous people, convert them, and care for them. In return, they were allowed to use their labor. In reality, however, it meant forced labor and exploitation. Entire villages had to work in mines, cultivate fields, and pay tribute. Millions of indigenous people died from hunger, overwork, and disease. The Spanish crown worked closely with the Catholic Church. Missionaries accompanied the conquest, founded monasteries and schools, and saw it as their task to convert the heathens to Christianity. At the same time, some individual clergymen tried to criticize the worst abuses. The most famous was Bartolomé de las Casas, who denounced the brutal treatment of indigenous people in the 16th century. But his words changed little in everyday life. With the colonies in South America and the silver fleets that regularly sailed to Spain, the Spanish Empire became the most powerful force in the world. People said that in this empire, the sun never set. But this splendor had a high price, and it rested on the labor and suffering of millions of people in the colonies. The Spanish conquest of South America was not only a military and economic project, it was also a religious one. For the Spanish crown, the Christianization of the new territories was just as important as the extraction of gold and silver. Spain saw itself as a bulwark of the Catholic faith and viewed the mission as a divine task. From the very beginning, priests and monks accompanied the conquistadors. They baptized the indigenous people, built churches, and tried to firmly anchor the Catholic faith in the daily life of the colonies. The Church quickly became one of the most powerful institutions in South America. It owned land, controlled schools, and shaped social life. In many cities, magnificent cathedrals were built to symbolize the triumph of Christianity. The Jesuits played a special role. From the 16th century onward, they founded missions in remote areas, for example in Paraguay or in the Amazon region. There they built settlements in which indigenous people were educated, Christianized, and raised in the European way of life. The Jesuit missions are still regarded today as fascinating experiments. They offered protection from the brutal exploitation of the encomenderos, but at the same time they were centers of strict religious control. Christianization, however, also meant the destruction of indigenous religions. Temples were demolished or converted into churches, images of gods were burned, rituals were forbidden. For many indigenous people, this was a deep rupture. They lost not only their political structures, but also their spiritual world. And yet the religions did not disappear completely. Much merged with Christianity. Indigenous symbols and traditions were integrated into Catholic festivals. In this way, a syncretic religion emerged, one that connected elements from both worlds, visible, for example, in processions, cults of saints, or festivals such as Dia de los Muertos. Some clergymen were horrified by the brutality of the conquest. The Dominican monk Bartolomé de las Casas was one of the best-known critics. In his writings, such as a short account of the destruction of the Indies, he denounced the cruelties that Spaniards committed against indigenous people. His efforts did lead to some reforms, such as the new laws of 1542, which were intended to limit the abuse of the encomiendas, but in practice little changed. Economic interest weighed more heavily than moral appeals. In the end, the mission was successful. Today, almost all countries of South America are predominantly Catholic. Churches shape escapes, and religious festivals shape the year. At the same time, however, many traditions of indigenous religions have survived, often hidden or dressed in Christian forms. Religion thus became one of the most powerful tools of colonization and a legacy that still shapes South America today. The Spanish colonization of South America was not only an adventure for conquistadors or a mission project for the Church. Above all, it was an economic enterprise. Spain wanted wealth, raw materials, and power, and South America was exploited for this like hardly any region before. The best-known symbol of this exploitation is probably the silver mine of Potosi in present-day Bolivia. In 1545, the Spaniards discovered a mountain full of silver there, the Cerro Rico. Soon Potosi became one of the largest cities in the world, with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants who worked almost exclusively in mining. For Spain, Potosi was an incomparable treasure. Immeasurable quantities of silver were shipped to Europe, filled the royal treasury, and made Spain the leading world power. For the workers, however, Potosi was a place of horror. Indigenous people were forced into compulsory labor through the Mita system. Under catastrophic conditions, they toiled in the tunnels, often until their deaths. It is said that over the course of the centuries, millions of people died in the mines. Besides silver, gold also played an important role. Especially in the early years of the conquest, countless temples were looted and gold treasures were brought to Spain. Soon large plantations were also created, where sugarcane, cocoa, tobacco, and cotton were grown. These products were exported to Europe on a large scale, at the expense of the indigenous population, which was forced to work. But because indigenous people died in large numbers from disease and overwork, the Spaniards began bringing African slaves to South America in the 16th century. In this way, the colonial economy became part of the Atlantic slave trade. The wealth from South America made Spain the leading power in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. With the silver from Potosi, Spain was able to finance its wars, build palaces, and support works of art. But the wealth also had dark sides. The enormous dependence on the colonies meant that Spain's own economy remained weak. While silver flowed to Madrid, domestic agriculture and industry became poorer. In the end, the splendor of the colonies was also a curse for Spain itself. For South America, the colonial economy meant suffering and destruction. Indigenous people were dispossessed and enslaved. Millions died in mines and on plantations. Societies were destroyed, their structures broken. And yet new structures also emerged: cities, trade routes, a colonial upper class. The economy was brutal, but it laid the foundation for the world we see in South America today. The Spanish colonies in South America were shaped not only by wealth and exploitation, but also by a strict social hierarchy. The place a person occupied in society depended less on achievement or wealth and more on origin and blood. At the very top stood the peninsulares, those born in Spain. They saw themselves as the true representatives of the crown and claimed the most important offices in politics, the church, and administration. For them it was clear: only someone who came from the motherland was a true Spaniard. Directly below them stood the Creoles, people of Spanish descent who had been born in South America. They possessed wealth, estates, and influence, but were often treated by the peninsulares as second-class citizens. This very contradiction, rich and powerful, but excluded from political participation, would later become one of the driving forces of the independence movements. Below them began a society of mixing. Mestizos were descendants of Spaniards and indigenous people. They quickly grew into a large population group. Often, they had more rights than indigenous people, but fewer than Creoles. Indigenous people formed the largest population group. For them, colonial rule usually meant hard work in mines and fields, dispossession, and the loss of their traditional way of life. African slaves were brought to South America in growing numbers, especially to plantations in Portuguese Brazil and in Spanish colonies, such as Venezuela or Colombia. Society was strictly ordered according to purity of blood. The whiter someone was, the higher they stood in the hierarchy. People of mixed ancestry were classified in a true caste system, with dozens of names for every possible combination of origin. These classifications determined life, rights, duties, access to education or offices. All of this depended on origin. Despite the strict hierarchy, life in the colonies was colorful and diverse. Markets full of goods from all over the world: cocoa, sugar, silver, spices, mixed with indigenous products such as corn or potatoes. Spanish cities with cathedrals and palaces arose beside villages, in which indigenous traditions continued to live. The colonies were a place of collision, but also of the mixing of cultures that still shapes the face of South America today. As powerful as the Spanish crown was in South America, it never ruled unchallenged. From the beginning, there was resistance against the conquest and the colonial order. Some uprisings were local and small, others shook entire regions. Already in the first decades after the conquest, indigenous groups rose up against the Spaniards. Some tried to reconquer their old empires. Others fled into inaccessible regions in order to preserve their freedom. The Andes, the Amazon, or the Pampas, regions emerged into which the Spaniards could hardly penetrate. Here, indigenous traditions often survived longer than in the centers of colonial power. African slaves also resisted. In many colonies, groups of slaves fled into the wilderness and founded quilombos or palenques, free communities that escaped Spanish rule. They often defended their independence for decades. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, uprisings repeatedly occurred in Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. Indigenous people fought against encomenderos, against forced labor in the mines, and against the destruction of their religions. The Spaniards reacted brutally. Uprisings were crushed, leaserds were publicly executed, villages were burned down. But resistance never completely stopped. The best-known uprising was that of Tupac Amaru II in 1780. He was a mestizo and claimed to be a descendant of the Inca kings. In the Andes of Peru, he called for a fight against Spanish rule. His movement united indigenous people, mestizos, and even some Creoles. Hundreds of thousands joined him. Entire regions were controlled by the rebels, and for a moment it seemed as if colonial power could begin to waver. But the Spaniards struck back with full force. The uprising was crushed in 1781. Tupac Amaru II was brutally executed. Nevertheless, he remained a symbol of resistance, and later an inspiration for the independence movements. As brutal as colonial power was, resistance never completely fell silent. Every generation had its heroes and martyrs. And the longer the colonial period lasted, the stronger the idea grew that South America would not remain under Spanish rule forever. In the 18th century, the world began to change. New ideas, new revolutions, and new power relations shook the old order, and the Spanish colonies in South America were not left untouched by this. In Europe, philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu preached freedom, equality, and the rights of man. Books, pamphlets, and discussions also spread into the colonies, often secretly, sometimes openly, in the sons of the Creole elites. For many Creoles, this was a wake-up call. Why should they continue to be ruled by officials from Madrid when they themselves produced the wealth of their land? Why should they remain second-class citizens only because they were not born in Spain? In 1776, the 13 colonies of North America declared their independence from Great Britain. When the United States actually became free after a long war, it was a signal to the whole world. Colonies, too, could defeat their metropoles. In South America, the revolution was followed with great attention. Newspapers reported about George Washington, about constitutions, and about freedom. For the Creoles, it became clear what was possible in North America could also happen here. In 1789, the French Revolution shook Europe. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These slogans also circulated in South America. Many Creoles saw in them a confirmation of their own demands for more rights. Why should they remain second-class citizens only because they were not born in Spain? In 1776, the 13 colonies of North America declared their independence from Great Britain. When the United States actually became free after a long war, it was a signal to the whole world. Colonies, too, could defeat their metropoles. In South America, the revolution was followed with great attention. Newspapers reported about George Washington, about constitutions, and about freedom. For the Creoles, it became clear what was possible in North America could also happen here. In 1789, the French Revolution shook Europe. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These slogans also circulated in South America. Many Creoles saw in them a confirmation of their own demands for more rights. At the same time, the revolution spread fear. For the Spanish crown, these ideas were dangerous. They threatened to destroy the colonial system from the ground up. The decisive moment came in 1808, when Napoleon invaded Spain and forced King Ferdinand VII from the throne. Spain was weakened from within. Its authority in the colonies crumbled. In South America, a question arose that changed everything. If the king in Spain has been overthrown, to whom do we still owe obedience? Many Creoles used the opportunity to form their first governments of their own. Officially, they only wanted to administer the colonies in the name of the king. In truth, however, this was the beginning of independence, the seed of freedom. In this way, the thinking of the Enlightenment combined with the political upheavals in Europe. The colonies were no longer willing to see themselves as eternal subjects. A new generation of leaders emerged. Men such as Simón Bolivar and José de San Martín. They would soon become the spearhead of the wars of liberation. At the beginning of the 19th century, a time of revolutions began in South America. Inspired by the Enlightenment, encouraged by the American and French revolutions, and favored by Spain's weakness under Napoleon, the colonies rose up. It was the beginning of the long struggle for independence. Around 1810, uprisings already broke out in many cities. In Buenos Aires, Caracas, Bogotá, and Santiago, so-called juntas were formed, local governments that claimed to rule in the name of the deposed king, but in reality took the first step toward independence. Not all movements succeeded immediately. Some uprisings were brutally suppressed, but the spirit of freedom could no longer be crushed. The best-known leader of South American independence was probably Simón Bolivar from Venezuela. Born into a wealthy Creole family and shaped by travels to Europe, he developed the vision of a free, united South America. Between 1813 and 1824, Bolivar led a series of campaigns that carried him through half of South America: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and finally the founding of a new state, Bolivia, which bears his name. Bolivar was celebrated as the Libertador, the liberator. But his vision of a united federation of South America failed. The regional differences were too great, and the self-interests too strong. While Bolivar fought in the north, José de San Martín led the movement in the south. Coming from Argentina, he crossed the Andes with his army in 1817, a legendary march, and defeated the Spanish troops in Chile. He then moved on to Peru, where he met Bolivar. San Martín left the leadership to Bolivar, withdrew, and is still regarded today as the quiet hero of South American liberation. Decisive moments of independence were battles such as Carabobo in 1821 in Venezuela, where Bolivar broke Spanish power, and Ayacucho in 1824 in Peru, which finally sealed the end of Spanish rule in South America. After these victories, it was clear. The Spanish colonial empire in South America was history. The colonies became independent states: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. Spain lost almost all of its South American possessions within a few years. As triumphant as liberation was, the period afterward was just as difficult. Bolivar had dreamed of a united South America, but instead, the continent broke apart into many states. Rivalries, civil wars, and power struggles shaped the first decades. Nevertheless, independence was irreversible. South America was free, and the colonial period had come to an end. Independence had been won, the Spanish troops defeated, the viceroys driven out. But the road to freedom did not automatically mean stability. On the contrary, the young republics of South America faced enormous challenges. The colonial period had left behind societies that were deeply divided. Creoles, mestizos, indigenous people, and descendants of African slaves lived side by side, but not as equals. Maids, many rights still remained in the hands of the elites. In addition, there was a lack of experience with self-government. Instead of strong institutions, caudillos, military leaders, and regional strongmen often determined politics. They fought each other, seized power, and overthrew governments. Civil wars were the order of the day. Economically, South America also remained dependent. Although silver no longer flowed to Spain, the young republics were dependent on the export of raw materials: silver, copper, cattle, coffee, or rubber. New trading partners took Spain's place, above all Great Britain. South America was politically free, but economically it remained part of a global system in which the great powers set the tone. Although Spain had lost its colonies, its influence did not disappear overnight. The language remained Spanish, the religion Catholic, and the administrative systems were strongly shaped by the colonial period. Cultural traces were also visible: cities with plazas and cathedrals, legal systems based on Spanish traditions. Even the hierarchies between whites and non-whites remained in many societies. At the same time, however, something new began. The peoples of South America developed their own identities: Argentinians, Chileans, Peruvians, Venezuelans. They all formed nations that were more than copies of Spain. In literature, music, and art, forms of expression emerged that connected elements of European, indigenous, and African traditions. Independence was therefore not only a political new beginning, but also a cultural one. Spanish colonial rule ended in the 19th century, but its traces are still visible today. Language, religion, social structures, even conflicts and inequalities have their roots in the colonial period. One of the most visible legacies is the language. With the exception of Brazil and a few regions, almost all countries of South America speak Spanish today. It has become the mother tongue of hundreds of millions of people and still connects the continent culturally. Spanish influences are also everywhere in literature, music, and architecture. Colonial cities such as Cusco, Quito, or Cartagena bear the stamp of Spanish architecture. Cathedrals, squares, and administrative buildings shape their appearance. The mission was so successful that Catholicism remains the dominant religion of South America to this day. Church festivals, veneration of saints, and processions are part of the cultural life of many countries. At the same time, indigenous traditions have survived and mixed with Christianity. In festivals, rituals, and symbols, one often finds a fascinating syncretism, a mixture of old and new worlds of belief. The colonial social order has left its traces. Racism, inequality, and social hierarchies continue to exist today. In many countries, descendants of Europeans still have more power and influence, while indigenous communities and Afro-South Americans are often disadvantaged. These inequalities lead to social tensions, protests, and political movements demanding more justice, even in the present. Economically, too, the colonial period continues to have an effect. For a long time, South America remained a continent that exported raw materials and imported finished goods, a pattern that was already created in the colonial period. Politically, continuities are also visible. Centralized systems, strong militaries, and corruption have roots in the structures of colonial administration. The colonial period brought suffering, exploitation, and destruction, but it also formed the basis for the modern nations of South America. Today, Spain's legacy is visible everywhere, in language, culture, religion, and in the struggles for equality and recognition. The history of the Spanish colonies in South America is a history full of contradictions. It begins with the euphoria of discovery and the adventures of the conquistadors. But at the same time, it is a story of oppression, exploitation, and suffering. For Spain, South America was the key to world power. Gold and silver from the Andes made the country rich and powerful. But this wealth was based on the forced labor of millions of indigenous people and African slaves, a foundation of blood. When the independence movements triumphed in the 19th century, Spain lost its greatest colonial empire. From an empire in which the sun never set, what remained was a kingdom on the edge of Europe. For South America, independence was the beginning of a new chapter. Colonies became nations: Argentina, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela, and many more. They developed their own identities, shaped by a unique mixture of European influences, indigenous traditions, and African heritage. But the colonial period had left deep marks. Inequalities, social tensions, and political instability accompanied the young republics and are still partly visible today. Even today, we feel the legacy of this era. Spanish is the common language of almost an entire continent. Catholicism shapes society and culture. Colonial power structures continue to have an effect in politics and the economy. At the same time, history shows how resistance, adaptation, and cultural mixing created something new, a South American identity that is unique. The Spanish colonial period in South America was a time of violence and destruction, but also of transformation. From the scars of the past, new nations emerged that today follow their own path. Colonial history is therefore not only a chapter of the past. It is the origin of the present and explains why South America is the way we know it today: diverse, contradictory, alive,